or I guess depending on where you're calling from. I may be saying good morning or good evening, but my name is Joan Tabachnick, and I'm the director of Neary Press, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is Treating Adult Sex Offenders, Safe Offender Strategies, and the Role of Self-Regulation in Sex Offender Treatment with Dr. Jill Stinson. Before I turn this over to Dr. Stinson, I want to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about Neary Press. And just to say that our mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. And since you're on, I will also maybe put my webcam on as well, so you're not by yourself there, Jill. Anyway, Jill, really want to say a really huge welcome to you. And as I talk about Neary Press, I just want to say our mission is to share the cutting-edge research and the best practices emerging in our field. And for many years, we did that mostly just through through book sales, but now we offer online courses, free newsletter, face-to-face workshops, as well as most recently these webinars by some of our internationally recognized authors. Before we get started, I also want to just have a sense of just how many people here have participated in the Neary Press webinar before. And I was wondering if you could launch that poll pin for me, that would be great. And maybe while you're answering, while that poll is getting launched, I can just say that basically I want to just ask you also to consider becoming a sponsor of our webinar series. And like NPR, your donation is really what makes these webinars possible. We don't have funding for this. So it's your support that allows us to continue and to bring you a lot of free resources as well. Tim, were you able to launch that? And maybe you can just jump on and give us some of the results of that too. That would be helpful. You there, Tim?
Yeah, I am. I apologize.
And can you launch? Have you launched the poll? All right, I think we'll go on. I'll just go ahead and go on and just sort of talk a little bit about the learning objectives as well here. So basically, in terms of like any other workshop, we have learning objectives. So the three learning objectives for this workshop is to review the role of self-regulation and self-regulatory deficits in the development of problematic sexual behavior. Conceptualize the treatment goals of varied sex offender groups within this framework and examine methods for incorporating sex offender strategies into broader treatment programming. And third, discuss preliminary research data in support of this model of treatment. The second thing I wanted to say that we have a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint that you're looking will be posted or has been posted on the Neary Press webinar. And then when this is over, we'll also, within a week, also doing posting a recording of this webinar. And third, I wanted to say when this is over, if you could please close out your account, we'll be sending you an evaluation form. And it really is that your feedback that helps us figure out what makes these work and what makes these worthwhile. And after about a week, we'll be sending you a follow-up email that has a link to both the this recording as well as to the PowerPoint. And then on our website, you can also look at getting continuing education credit. So there's a fee for that, and you can get them through Orlando Behavioral Health Services. I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about this wonderful book called Treating Sex Offenders by Dr. Jill Stinson and Dr. Judith Becker. In this book, basically it's the structured yet flexible sort of manual presents an innovative group treatment approach that targets the deficits in self-regulation, which is, as many of you know, is a central problem for sex offenders. And the sex offender strategy, the SOSs, comprised of 10 evidence-based modules that teach participants the skills to desist from problematic behaviors, manage their emotions and impulses, and break unhealthy relationship patterns. So it's an excellent book, an excellent resource, and you can order that through Neary Press. And last, I wanted to take a moment to introduce our guest speaker today, Jill Stinson, and I'm really thrilled to have Jill with us today. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Stinson is Director of Clinical Training in the Department of Psychology at East Tennessee State University. Dr. Stinson's research emphasizes the role of serious mental illness and self-regulatory problems in the development and maintenance of sexual offending behaviors. She's authored 2 books on sex offender etiology and treatment, as well as many articles and chapters relating to offender treatment issues. She is the Associate Editor of the Association for Treatment of Sexual Abusers journal called Sexual Abuse, and also an active member of ATSA. It's really a great pleasure that I can welcome you today, Jill. And I'm going to turn this over to you now, and I think we're ready to go. So we have to unmute, if you can unmute yourself so we can hear you too, that would be great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Now that's just perfect.
Now
Thank
I can
you.
talk.
Yeah. And are you, is the show my screen showed up on your board yet? Tim, can you have that go over to Jill so it says show my screen? Great. So if you can put that in the slideshow mode, Jill will be all set to go. And thank you very much.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yeah.
All right.
If you can just put the yes and no in slideshow mode, that's perfect.
All right, there we go.
Right.
It kept going back and forth between being muted and unmuted. All right, apologize for that little technical glitch there. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar. I'm very excited that Joan asked me to do this. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous. I know I see the number of attendees popping up, and I'm going to try to ignore that as much as I can. But today we're going to be talking about safe offender strategies, which is, as Joan mentioned, the treatment manual that I authored with Dr. Judith Becker from the University of Arizona. And so just to start out, there we go. Just to start out, one of the things that we want to just acknowledge is that sex offender treatment certainly isn't easy. So for those of you who are listening who have done sex offender treatment, researched sex offender treatment, worked with sex offenders for many years, you know this is a vast understatement. There are many challenges and complications in the work that we do, and I think that that is what makes it so important for us to be continuing our education and learning new things about how we work with sex offenders and different ways of addressing problems. I think with me, for example, my history and knowing how I approach treatment, I'm a person who does DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and that's something that will be very evident as we go through this approach. But I also think it's always good to have a number of tools available to help you with such complex problems and such complex patients. So first, as we start out, I want to go back a little bit and talk about theory before we delve into what the treatment itself entails. And so, as Joan mentioned, I've authored a couple of books, and the first one of these was about sex offender etiology. And so this book explored the history of sex offender etiology and what we know and what we don't in many ways about why people engage in sex offending behaviors. And one of the things that we came to as I wrote this book with Judith Becker and also Dr. Bruce Sales is that it's a very complex process and that it has to be developmental in nature, that we really need to be looking at this as a developmental thing. And I think it's very important for any treatment approach to be based very heavily in theory. So the theory that SOS is based upon is the multimodal self-regulation theory. And this looks at of what leads people to have self-regulatory deficits that may lead them to engage in problematic sexual behavior. So the core underlying feature of this theory is self-regulation and how people modulate their thoughts and their emotions and their behaviors and their interpersonal interactions with other people. So we start very early with sort of understanding about biology and temperament. And again, since this is the foundational piece is self-regulation, what we're looking at are characteristics not necessarily associated strictly with sex offending, but associated with self-regulatory problems. And here we conceptualize self-regulation rather broadly and looking at it in terms of everyone having sort of their own homeostatic set point of comfort with a variety of different internal and external experiences. So a comfort point with emotion or a comfort point with the way that you're thinking or viewing the world. And to some extent, these things are innate, and to a large extent, they're also learned over time. And so what we do know is that people are born with different levels or set points, particularly for emotion. For example, we've had a lot of fMRI research over the years come out showing that people have different levels of early reactivity to emotional experiences and the way the brain responds. And so we look at the developmental literature that tells us basically there are fussy infants and non-fussy infants. And so this is not news to anyone who has children or has been around children or has heard about yourself as a child. You know there are differences in infant temperament, and usually what that's an indicator of is how infants are responding to the environment. Well, these are early indicators of self-regulation, and so we know that people vary in terms of their ability to respond to things in the environment, how strong their response is, and how easily they may return to a baseline. So if we think about it simply in terms of emotion, a baby may become upset. Some babies become upset more easily, some become upset more strongly, and some have greater difficulty returning to a state of what they consider normalcy or comfort. We also know that everyone has variable levels of comfort over time. And this is what we see as temperament. Now, temperament persists obviously into adulthood, and rather than referring to people as fussy or non-fussy, we refer to them as sensitive, for example. And so these are early precursors to how we see people start learning to regulate how they feel and what they're experiencing in their environment. This is obviously affected by their environment in that you know, people are constantly interacting with other persons or things or events, including their internal environment as well. And so depending on how people respond to those signs of discomfort, or as I'll explain it in a minute, dysregulation, we see them learning how to regulate. So if a child is upset and someone sits down and says to them, why don't you tell me what's going on, or maybe you'd feel better if you ate something or took a nap, those are early ways of communicating how somebody can regulate themselves when they're showing signs of distress. Now, the problem is people aren't always well matched or well suited to their environment in terms of their level of variability in comfort. So if a child is showing signs of distress, it may be that the parents are trying to cope with it adequately or trying to teach them skills, but it's not enough. Or it could be that the parent isn't coping with it very effectively and making things worse. It could also be that they're coping with it very well and teaching the child how to regulate that experience or how to deal with it. So if we think of it in terms of an emotion like anger, you know, if a child becomes angry, a parent may know what to do, a parent or teacher or someone else in their environment. They may know what to do, and they may be able to teach the child regulatory skills to modulate that experience of anger. They may know skills but may not work, right? They may try to teach them skills that just don't cut it for that individual, frankly. Or you may have instances where parenting or other influences in the child's environment are hostile or abusive, and instead they get angry and they yell at the child. They may do something that makes the child even angrier or more upset, or they may also just ignore it entirely, which sends very mixed signals about, well, how do I respond to this emotional experience that I'm having? These are all ways that people begin to learn how to regulate their experiences, whether they be emotions or interactions with other people, or even how they think. And so it all leads into this process of self-regulation. And here we look at self-regulation and self-regulatory skills as serving a definite function. They are functional if they work to change the experience the person is having. Now, it doesn't have to make them feel better, but it just makes them feel differently than they do now. So we look at function versus dysfunction. Dysfunction means it doesn't work. So it may be a skill that other people are using that works for them just fine, but it isn't working for that individual. We also, though, look at skills in terms of whether they're adaptive or maladaptive. And so adaptive skills are those that don't hurt you or anybody else around you or don't cause the potential for harm. Maladaptive skills, on the other hand, are those that could potentially be harmful or dangerous either to you or the people around you. And so the important thing to remember in this as we move through, and we're moving through this very quickly, I understand, is that functional skills may still be very maladaptive. And so things that people may do to change the way that they feel may be problematic in some other way. So people are constantly driven to try and find a way to regulate themselves. We don't have to teach them to need to regulate. What we have to teach people to do is how to regulate effectively and adaptively. And so if you take a child who's exhibiting some difficulty with regulation, or as we know from the trauma literature, even if they're fine with regulation but very terrible things happen to them, we can make it difficult for them to regulate, unfortunately. But if we know that somebody is having difficulty in their early environment with regulating their emotional and cognitive and interpersonal and behavioral experiences, they will constantly be looking for ways to try and learn adaptive or maladaptive skills. What they're going for really is function. And so they may learn skills that don't sufficiently work. It's like when I get angry and somebody tells me to sit down and read a book and I'll be calm. That doesn't happen very well. So all of us can think of experiences where people have said, you know, watch this show, it's my favorite, and it doesn't work for you. If you think of that on a much grander scale, when somebody doesn't have something else to fall back on, you can imagine how helpless they must feel, and they get a little desperate. So it's rare that people have no skills at all. What's more common is they have skills that don't sufficiently work, they work halfway, or they have skills that work but are pretty maladaptive. And so these may be things they've modeled from their environment, things that clients have told me over the years, that they knew when their mom was depressed, she would drink. Or when their dad was angry, he would hit people or throw things. They model these skills to some extent, and they learn that they're effective in changing the way a person feels in the moment. What we see with people who have really pervasive difficulty with regulating themselves well is they gravitate toward a certain type of skill, and that's a skill that's usually something that involves very little effort. So, you know, taking a drug or getting drunk or high doesn't involve a whole lot of effort for people. Hurting others, unfortunately, doesn't involve a lot of effort, so it may be something that people gravitate to relatively easily if they don't have good behavioral control. And also sexual behaviors may be one that elicit a really strong effect for people without maybe the internal planning and effort that we would see involved with other skills. And so that kind of moves us to the next stage, which is the role of reinforcement. And skills have to be reinforced over time for us to continue using them. If you try to use a skill and it absolutely does not work, or it makes things worse for you, you're much less likely to try that skill again in the future. Things that work tend to be the things that people repeat. Now, the role of reinforcement is somewhat misunderstood, I think, often because we think about violent behaviors or sex offending behaviors as ones that we imagine, you know, how could anybody think that that's a good idea? But if you think about it in terms of physiology, you can see that reinforcement can happen without the person even really being consciously aware of it, particularly with sexual behavior. And so experiences like adrenaline rush or orgasm can be extremely reinforcing, even though there are extremely negative consequences for that type of behavior if it's a maladaptive behavior. The other thing that we see is that there's a role of cognitive worldview and personality, and that affects how people view opportunities for engaging in sexual misconduct or problematic sexual behavior. You know, things that have happened to folks early on in life teach them things about the world and how people are. So we know things like the hostile attribution bias are very prevalent among offenders, thinking that other people are out to get them. We look at the role of early traumas and early unhealthy experiences or maltreatment in people's lives to see kind of where they see themselves fitting in. And we know that characteristics like entitlement and impulsivity and judgments about other people are very prominent in the offender literature. So the question that we ask ourselves then is where is the pathology as we look at this? Because it's easy to see the pathology as this is a maladaptive behavior, you're hurting people, you're engaging in problematic sexual behaviors. But we look at it even earlier as the pathology is not so much the experience of having intense urges or emotions, but lacking the ability to effectively cope with them in a way that's adaptive and non-harmful. So as we move into talking about safe offender strategies as a treatment, we move into the central role of dysregulation. Now, dysregulation is a term that is used to describe that feeling of discomfort or that feeling that you are somehow off of your set point, where you no longer feel comfortable with the way things are happening for you. And I have 4 domains on this slide. There's actually 5. There's physiological dysregulation as well, but I've not included that one because the literature on that doesn't seem to strongly support it. It's more of a behavioral issue when we look at the types of physiological dysregulation that may precipitate maladaptive sexual behavior. But if we think about these experiences, dysregulation in and of itself is very normal. We like to think of dysregulation as abnormal or pathological because it's not an experience we like to have. And when we see it in offenders, we see it in its extreme forms because they're largely unable to deal with it very effectively, and so we see it as being something that's worse. But I think the point that we really want to get at here is that there's dysregulation in a variety of domains, and that each person has their own patterns of dysregulation that present themselves in terms of, you know, treatment and what we can address in treatment with safe offender strategies. And so when we think about emotional dysregulation, these are experiences like feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling lonely. They can be good experiences as well. It's any time you kind of move away from that comfort zone. And so I've worked with a lot of clients who have serious mental illness, and they'll talk about experiences of mania. And even though they like the feeling of mania, they like that euphoria, one of them once, I think very accurately, kind of equated it to, you know, he said, you know, when kids go to an amusement park and they have way too much cotton candy and ride every single ride, and then they're really, really hyper to the point where they're cranky and irritable and sick, he equated that to coming down off of being manic, or what it's like to constantly be on the edge of euphoria and irritability. And I think that's a really good description of emotional dysregulation that may be associated with positive emotion too. Cognitive dysregulation is one that's a little different for people to conceptualize. Traditionally, we've talked about thinking errors. I personally tend to think of this as cognitive dysregulation simply because I don't know that it's an error if everyone has them to some extent. We all catastrophize. We all personalize things at times. I don't think this is necessarily an abnormal or pathological experience. I think a lot of people have it. I think what it is a sign that your thoughts have kind of gotten out of your control. Maybe you have a moment where you're thinking, wow, I am being really judgmental. And you're not comfortable with that. In fact, you're so uncomfortable it comes to your awareness that you're judging someone or you're thinking negatively. Other cognitive forms of dysregulation may not be as based on content but process. So they may be things, content-wise, they may be things like judgment or hostility or hostile attributions. But I think in terms of process, they may be things like disorganized thinking, difficulty with problem solving, you know, memory deficits, those sorts of things that clients may have as well. In terms of interpersonal dysregulation, these are when the interaction is dysregulated, and everyone, again, has their own sort of set point for what they're comfortable with. I know some people who really thrive on arguing, and they like, I don't want to say they like conflict, but they like arguing with people and they consider it a good thing, whereas other people shy away from that and they're very uncomfortable with any kind of confrontation or arguing. I think that's sort of a reflection of individual differences in interpersonal dysregulation. And things we see in offenders that are signs of interpersonal dysregulation are things like lying, being manipulative, lack of commitment or fluctuating levels of commitment. You know, one day they're all in for treatment, the next day no interest whatsoever, or they don't think they need it. You know, hostility also falls in there as well. So I think those we can see in our clients, and we can more easily detect those because we experience them along with the client. And then finally, behavioral dysregulation. These are things that the person does that may go outside of their comfort zone or outside of other people's comfort zones. These may be things that are highly maladaptive or things that are sort of maladaptive. Obviously, our outcomes like maladaptive sexual behaviors or violence or aggression or behavioral dysregulation, but problems with impulsivity, procrastination, things like that can also be behavioral dysregulation as well. And the whole goal of this process is to look at a person and identify where their major areas of dysregulation are and where they seem to have deficits in coping adequately with that dysregulation, and then we want to target that in treatment. And so the good thing is this coincides very well with dynamic predictors of risk and what we know about recidivism and sort of what offenders need to address in treatments. Sexual self-regulation and self-regulation have consistently been demonstrated in Hansen's meta-analyses as a factor, or two factors, I guess, that predict risk if people have limited ability to regulate themselves well. And I think this just delves into it in greater detail. What we're looking at in terms of safe offender strategies and what we do with people is we're looking at behavioral dysregulation, that's our outcome, and the idea that these are maladaptive self-regulatory strategies, that people are engaging in these behaviors because they change the way that the person is experiencing things, and they are meant to get them back to that homeostatic state, and that if we can teach them more effective ways of doing that, then they won't, well, I don't want to say they won't need to do these other things. We don't want them to do these other things, so it does require a great deal of motivation on their part. In terms of risk needs and responsivity, you know, SOS as a treatment is addressing a lot of the things that have been indicated in the research as related to risk needs responsivity framework. Particularly, we have modules that are devoted to responsivity concerns, and then also looking at the various criminogenic needs. And so some of the things like pro-criminal, attitudes and behaviors, that would be a sign of cognitive dysregulation, right? If people have these unhealthy beliefs that are in support of their maladaptive behavior or criminal offending, we would conceptualize that as cognitive dysregulation. And as you know, there are a number of offenders with whom you've probably worked who share these beliefs and believe that victims aren't truly harmed by this behavior, or if they weren't caught, it's okay. And we hear that, and those are obviously still targets of treatment. Okay, so in terms of what the modules actually address, there are 10 modules in Safe Offender Strategies, and the modules are designed in such a way as to address those different areas of dysregulation. Now, there are a few other modules thrown in. So the first module is all about motivation and uses motivational interviewing and looks at why people are in treatment and what types of things they bring to treatment in terms of their own preconceived fears, their judgments, their attitudes about treatment. Module 2 looks at some basic treatment concepts. So we introduce for people this idea of self-regulation and dysregulation, and we teach the clients what that is, and then we go through a process of behavioral chain analysis with one or more of their offenses to identify their own patterns of dysregulation and where they think they could stand to use some work in developing more effective and more adaptive regulatory skills. Now, sometimes clients come in and they already know. They'll list off, I have problems with anger, I have problems with this, but usually we find other things that are helpful for them as well, and we may be able to see it as it's occurring. But each module beyond that is designed to target specific areas of dysregulation, including a specialized module that is looking at sexual development and sexual regulation, in addition to a later module that looks at other forms of maladaptive behavior. So we did this in such a way that each module is designed very specifically. You start out with a description of kind of normative functioning in that area. So for emotions, that's one of the early ones we talk about. You know, what are emotions, and how do people learn about emotions, and how do people experience emotions, and are they any good, and why do we have them? And then we talk about what emotional dysregulation looks like, and then we talk about how does that relate to sex offending. And then we go into specific skills. Now, unlike DBT or other structured skills treatments, we don't give a list of skills and say, here are the ones you have to learn, mainly because the folks with whom we were working to pilot this largely had their own treatment programs that they were learning skills, just they were called different things, and rather than making clients learn a whole new set of acronyms, we said just use the ones you've got. But within the text are a lot of lists of skills, and we ask clients to generate their own lists and practice them, and we use self-monitoring throughout the treatment so they can monitor their signs of dysregulation, what skills they're using, and then how well those skills are or are not working for them, recognizing that it's difficult to learn new skills and implement them consistently, and that they're uncomfortable at first for many people. So I'll skip down a little bit to the role of the treatment provider related to that. Some of what the treatment provider is there to do is not just moderate discussion among clients, but to normalize some of these experiences for them, because it is a challenge to learn new skills and to address these behaviors and to do something that you're not used to doing and think, well, this is stupid, it's not going to work. And often they'll come back and say, well, I felt really awkward. I'm like, yeah, because you haven't done it 300 times like you've done this other skill that you rely on more consistently. And so it's to be supportive and validating as they learn, you know, these new approaches to address dysregulation, and to also normalize dysregulation when they come in with a self-monitoring sheet and say something like, I didn't feel angry ever during the entire week. And I'm like, yeah, how? Because that's not normal. And so we also normalize these things for them as well. To some extent, we normalize urges that they may have. So I don't know about you guys, but I have clients who will tell me things like, the way to get better is I'll just never be sexually attracted to anyone else in my entire life. And that's not going to happen for them, you know. And so we also normalize, of course you're going to be attracted to people. Of course you're going to have sexual urges. It's all about how you deal with them and learning appropriate ways of managing it so that it doesn't cause harm. It is a long-term treatment. In terms of the structure, I'll talk about pilot research very briefly in a second. But in terms of structure, it is a long-term treatment. We did it in groups. And our target client population for this are people with serious mental illness or mental illness and also intellectual disability. Now, I've been asked, and I know it's being applied with offenders who don't meet those criteria, but I really wanted to target that population in particular because that's the one that I've spent most of my time working with, and I've, you know, had some disappointments in terms of how treatment is effective for them and how it addresses the complexity of many of their needs. So it's really meant for people who do need a lot of work and have a lot of skills deficits, and so it's a nice fit with that population. Now, in terms of empirical support, we've done 4 studies so far looking at, we've done 2 studies looking at the theory and then 2 studies looking at the actual implementation of the treatment. And so the first study that was done is this one depicted here. It's a sample of about 120, I think it's 120, sexually violent persons who were civilly committed. And we were interested mainly in just looking at dysregulation, kind of broadly defined. We threw in a number of measures, things that we thought were indicative primarily of emotional dysregulation because that one's pretty easy to measure. And looked at them in terms of, looked at those measures in terms of severity of sexual behavior. So we looked at deviant sexual behavior, number of arrests for sexual crimes, things like that, antisocial behaviors, and then substance abuse problems. And in a path analysis, we found that dysregulation did significantly predict the severity of paraphilias and sexual behaviors and also antisocial. And what was interesting is there was a relationship noted in the data between paraphilias and antisocial behaviors that once we added dysregulation to the model, that relationship was completely accounted for by dysregulation, and there was no longer an association between those things. We didn't predict substance use problems, but we think that part of that was that many of these men, because they were civilly committed under an SVP statute, hadn't actually used substances in about 40 years. And so current measures of dysregulation and current measures of substance use problems probably would not correlate very well. Our second study was with a different sample of forensic mental health offenders. We had around 250 sex offenders who were residing in maximum and intermediate psychiatric facility. And here we threw in cognitive dysregulation as well. So we had measures of emotional dysregulation that we did a factor analysis on some of these things, and these are what came out in our factors, and they very cleanly separated into indicators of emotional problems and indicators of cognitive problems. Now, this population, about 40% of them had a diagnosis of cognitive or intellectual disability, so that's why you see them clustering, particularly with regard to intellectual disability, IQ, history of special education. What we found is that we also we did a factor analysis that developed these factors or clusters of behavioral outcomes that we were interested in, and we named them in terms of criminal behavior, sexual behavior, and suicidal behavior. And here, in a regression model, emotional dysregulation was significantly associated with criminal behavior and suicidal behavior, and cognitive dysregulation was associated with all three outcomes of interest. And so this lent some support, and we're continuing to look at this and see where we can go next and how we can add additional measures, particularly wanting to add measures of cognitive dysregulation related to psychosis and thought disorder. Now, in terms of treatment outcome, at the time of its creation, SOS was being implemented in 2 psychiatric facilities. And for those of you who know my history, you'll know they were in Missouri because that's where I was for 7 years. So we spent 5 years piloting SOS in 2 different facilities in Missouri. And we selected a sample of 156 men who were in SOS groups across that 5 years, and the reason I say we selected the 156 is we needed people who had at least 6 months to a year of pre-treatment data, and then at least 6 months to 2 years of data while they were in treatment. So there were some who didn't meet those criteria, and we didn't have any basis for comparison with them. So what we did is we looked at a variety of different behaviors, both before treatment and during their first 2 years of being in SOS. They move very slowly in these groups there, and it was a rotating open group, so we were constantly having new members come in. And so after about the 2-year mark, most of them were halfway through the treatment manual. So we looked at a variety of behaviors. We looked at sex offending behaviors that had occurred within the facility, both before the treatment and then during the treatment implementation, as well as their sex offense responsibility subscale scores on the Sex Offender Treatment Intervention and Progress Scale by McGrath and colleagues out of Vermont. And here you can see that we found significant treatment effects as a function of percentage of groups that clients attended over the course of 2 years in terms of their incidence of sexual perpetration in the facility decreasing, as well as their scores lowering on this instrument. But what was interesting is that it didn't just affect their sexual behavior, and this really lent support to the idea that we were teaching them self-regulatory skills and teaching them more effective monitoring, self-monitoring. Because we also went, going through the charts, we coded all incidents of verbal aggression and physical aggression in 6-month increments. And we found that there was a significant treatment effect on those as well, in that people who attended a higher percentage of groups over the course of 2 years showed substantial significant decreases there in their incidence of verbal aggression toward other patients and staff, as well as acts of physical aggression. And then our second outcome study that we did prior to the implementation of SOS in the facility, they had used relapse prevention. Now, at that time, they had a much smaller population. They only treated people whose index offense was sex offending, so our groups were not the same size. Our relapse prevention group was about 33 people, and our SOS group was 58 people. But we tracked people who had been released, anywhere from 6 months to about 3 years. We used the relapse prevention sample that we gathered were all archival in nature. They had to be people I had never worked with because I was afraid I might have tainted them because I was a really bad relapse prevention therapist. I was already gravitating toward this other approach. And so we tracked them for, like I said, 6 months to 3 years post-release from the facility to see what their outcomes were. And we found that among the relapse prevention group, 9% of them were rearrested, only one of whom, there were 3, so there's not that many, but one of whom was arrested for a sexual offense post-release. And none of the people who had received SOS were rearrested following release. But importantly, because this is a forensic mental health population, we're not just interested in arrest with them, we're also interested in rehospitalization. Because oftentimes if they start showing signs of destabilization, they'll be rehospitalized before they can engage in some kind of really problematic behavior. And so for the facility in particular, they were interested in, does this treatment help us keep people in the community and keep them stable. And what we found is that 55% of the relapse prevention sample was rehospitalized at some point within the 3 years post-release. The mean point at rehospitalization was about 18 months, so year and a half, whereas only 5% of the SOS clients were rehospitalized. And so once again, we wondered if this had to do with just a more global success in teaching people more effective self-regulation, because often the reason for rehospitalization was not a sexual behavior problem, but that they were not taking their medications, or they were becoming aggressive in a group home, for example, or they had made threats against a case monitor, and so they were other signs of dysregulated behavior. But interestingly, also as part of that research, we looked at where they went, because we were interested in, you know, great, they're out, what's happening to them, are they stable? And so we looked at where they went. Many of them went to minimum security. From the SOS group, you can see that many of them went into minimum security and over time transitioned into community homes, and then community meaning they were living unsupervised. They weren't in a group home or a waiver home of some kind, and that's really impressive considering that nearly half of the SOS clients were people with mild to moderate intellectual disability and often needed assistance with daily living. None of them returned to high security. So while some of them may have been rehospitalized, meaning they went from a group home to minimum security, none of them went to intermediate or maximum security during follow-up. That was not the case with relapse prevention, in that while the community home folks were kind of stable, we saw returns to high security for a number of individuals within the first 2 years of them being released, and none of them were returned to the community without supervision of some kind. And so we again extrapolated from this that perhaps it was having a more general self-regulatory impact in helping them be more stable when they did leave the facility. All right, there was a lot in 30 minutes. So does anyone have any questions? I know Joan is going to be serving as our moderator here for this portion.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jill. It really, it is a lot to capture in just 30 minutes. And also, I guess I haven't really seen some of the results and statistics that you presented here, and it's just a comparison between what you're finding in the SOS and relapse prevention in terms of rehospitalization, return to facility. Like, I mean, that's really kind of amazing statistics. So, so thank you for sharing that. Especially since I think I grew up, you know, in this field with relapse prevention being the gold standard. I know that has shifted over time, and
Right.
And I'm just curious, like you mentioned, how you've integrated motivational interviewing into your modules, and I'm just wondering, the other sort of place where I know people have talked a lot about is, you know, working on good lives model, and I'm just sort of wondering if how you have integrated maybe some of the thinking of good lives model also into your 10 modules.
Not specifically in terms of incorporating good lives. I think more broadly, the fact that they both focus to some extent on self-regulation and adaptive, healthy ways of living, and they're not, I mean, mine, I will admit, SOS is more kind of risk-based good lives model. You know, they ascribe to a different philosophy, but I think overall a lot of the things are very compatible in terms of trying to help people just, for lack of any other way of saying it, I know it sounds kind of naive, but to have happier, more functional and successful lives. I think that's a shared goal, and I think looking at it in terms of, you know, people's goals for self-regulation are very similar.
Yeah. And I just want to encourage people, if they do have questions, you know, that please, you know, to please write them in. And I know that one person just wrote in that just bought the book, so thank you very much. That's wonderful. One person that came in as you, has polygraph ever been used on people within your SOS treatment?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the very first part.
Has a polygraph ever been used as part of your what you've been working on in terms of?
We didn't. We didn't use polygraphs with our clients. I don't know. I mean, I'm in thinking about where it fits in. I don't know if we developed that you didn't need them because we didn't have them. I think you could. I think, though, a lot of the things that we're really having people monitor are those things that you can't get at with a polygraph necessarily. And I have people who will ask me, well, how do you know, for example, when they're telling you this sequence of events that they're describing in relation to their offense, how do you know that that's accurate? And I don't, right? But I can tell very quickly in hearing a story from someone where things start going awry. You know, I'll have a client who's talking about how, you know, he was having this really miserable day, he was really angry at someone, and you know that the offense happened, right? Because you have reports on it. And then you'll say, well, what happened next? He goes, nothing, I just went home. Like, what'd you do about that anger? It's like, oh, it was fine. So you know. But what we do with people within SOS is we look at where everybody is. So it's a treatment that's designed to kind of meet people where they're at. And to me, that's a sign of progress or lack thereof. Like, they're not really ready to address some of the issues they need to address. Now, I don't spend a lot of time trying to elicit information from them, but I do talk with them about, well, maybe you don't want to talk about your offense, but this thing that happened on the ward last week, let's talk about that because we all saw it. So let's talk about what was happening that precipitated that thing there. So with regard to polygraphs, like I said, we didn't have them, so we didn't write it with the idea that they were a necessity. I guess if you did have them, it would be something that you could use to open conversation with clients about, you know, why they did or didn't report this or what was going on. You know, maybe they say, yes, that this happened. What you're really getting at is what led up to it. You know, this incident that occurred, what precipitated it. And so at least you have a basis that you have an identified incident at that point.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. That's really helpful. Someone also asked us, you know, that you talked about consideration of maybe some other measurements, and I'm wondering, have you considered using the ACEs at all as one thing that you might be studying with this group as well? This is the ACEs is the adult, now I'm blanking on what it stands for, but adverse childhood experiences. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's in the ACE study. Yes, we are actually doing that now.
Okay.
We have quite a bit of research going on right now looking at a variety of different offender populations, and we have a lot of data on ACEs in forensic mental health offenders and juveniles with sexual behavior problems and college students we were surprised at the number of college students who self-disclosed on surveys that they had engaged in coercive or manipulative sexual behavior, and we're looking at their ACEs as well. And so what we're doing then is looking at those in the context of how they've influenced self-regulatory deficits over time, or how they've influenced self-regulatory development. Because we're not surprisingly finding that, you know, these are populations with disproportionately high rates of trauma and maltreatment and just familial dysfunction, and seeing how that later affects their ability to regulate in a variety of domains.
Yeah, that makes sense. Something was actually, someone asked, actually I can start using names, I hadn't thought about this, but Laura Cooney, the one about ACEs was from Andy Kudak, and Laura Cooney Koss asked about, can the model be used with adolescents? It seems very, is it appropriate for them? And it was interesting about how you're working with civil commitment, but also as you're describing initially, it felt very sort of parent-centered actually in your conversation. So I'm wondering how, if you have applied this to adolescents, or how this might be work with adolescent populations.
Yeah, I would love to see it used with adolescents. We did not write it or pilot it on adolescents, so I'm sure there would have to be things that would need to be modified in terms of just, you know, sort of developmental level. Like I said, I do DBT, and I've done adolescent and I've done adult, and they're very different. You know, you have to do very different things to communicate with them and to work with them on that level. But I would love to see this sort of thing done with adolescents, because I think that is an age at which people are really ripe for learning a lot of these skills, and in some ways more amenable to it than adults are, because I don't want to say adult, well, I will. Adults are more set in their ways sometimes with regard to what skills they're going to use or what skills they're not going to use, and they'll say, well, that's just silly, I'm not going to do it. Whereas I found that despite the fact that often you think of adolescents as people who are unwilling to try new things, they are usually much more open to it, or at least open to the discussion, particularly when they recognize that their behavior is something that they don't want to continue. So I haven't used it with adolescents. There may be people out there who are, and I just don't know. But I think it would be great if that population, could get that as well.
Yeah, and just related to that, also someone asked about using this with sort of intellectual a population that might have intellectual disabilities, and have you used it with that group, or how is that being adopted?
Oh yeah, well we actually didn't adopt it for intellectual disability because it was developed for them. We had a lot of varying different levels of functioning in our groups, and so we never gave homework. There are worksheets, for example, in the book that we just did in session. The only homework we ever gave people was a self-monitoring sheet, and we had people with varying levels of literacy and varying ability to remember to do the homework, but it was always just basically rate how you're feeling. You've identified anger and loneliness and arguing with people, and if you argued with someone, make a hash mark, that sort of thing. But we really tailored it to, people who might not necessarily gravitate toward really heavy cognitive behavioral types of things. And so we found that going slowly and using lots and lots of examples and metaphors were very, very helpful. Getting them involved. I know, for example, we did it was funny at the time, but we did really good role plays with consent and what was consenting and what wasn't, and it really resonated with people, so that even though they couldn't really list the qualities of consent in an example, involving a surgical procedure, I'd say, what do you want to know from the doctor? And they can list everything that they need to know if they're going to have some major organ removed, and then we'd say, okay, how does that relate to sexual behavior? And so using lots of really concrete examples for people, particularly of dysregulation and how that manifests itself, was really helpful with that population, and they really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and people are asking, it's interesting. I think clearly the module offers a lot of interesting challenges. People are asking about the use of DBT and a few other approaches as well. And but I think maybe just because we don't have that many more, we have just a lot of questions coming in. So one question that people are asking also, can you maybe just describe, going back to the research for a moment, the age? Do you have a sense of the age range that you were working with? And also, I may have missed this as well, but someone asked about the risk level, or if you had looked at anything about that. So maybe you could just go over those two questions about the studies.
Okay. In terms of age, they were all adult, because none of them included juveniles. Now, we did have people as young as 18 or 19 who were in treatment, but all the way up into 70s, I think, say 78 may have been our oldest client, but these were all adult. They did range. We tried to categorize people in groups that they might feel comfortable with, so we tried not to put a bunch of 20-somethings in a group with a bunch of men in their 60s who would be really impatient with the 20-somethings. But yeah, so we had a pretty broad range. And then in terms of risk level, it varied. We had almost equal representation in different risk groups, and that was the one thing that I sort of regretted about how we had to implement it, because I mentioned that in terms of risk, needs, responsivity, you want to target it to level of risk, but we didn't quite have the luxury of doing that based on the administrative policies of the facility. It wasn't that we could say, well, this person only needs this much treatment and this person over here needs way more because of their risk. They had to, be in sex offender treatment until the time they were granted release, basically. There were people that we could say, okay, I think you're good, and people left before 10 modules. Some people left after 2 or 3 modules because they were doing well in other domains and in that domain as well. but I do regret that we weren't able to really tailor it risk-wise, and I think that's something that we'd like to see in the future is there sort of a streamlined version for people who may present with lower risk. We did have high-risk folks. They did have SVPs in another facility who were using it, and what they did to kind of up the level of intensity was that they had much more frequent groups, and the groups became infused throughout their programming. So that they had, you know, in addition to SOS group, they had groups related to that, maybe to reinforce more skills, for example, or a self-monitoring group or other things like that. So I think there was some recognition that for the high-risk folks, they needed more, either in terms of frequency or pervasiveness across different elements of their treatment, whereas the lower risk folks at that point were getting the same as high risk folks that were not SVPs.
Yeah, and that actually segues into a question from Gary Preston, who asked, were there advancement milestones that you used to measure sort of progression, and maybe just what was the average dimension of time for completion of the program?
Oh, well, so in terms of milestones, it was really complex because most of them were not just there because of sexual behavior problems. They were also there because of continuing aggression or because of really substantial mental health concerns. And so sometimes people would be making great progress in sex offender treatment, but not doing so well in terms of managing their mental health symptoms, or they're still showing some aggression. I kept trying to explain to staff, if we work on just one thing, they'll find something else. You know, we had one guy, we controlled his sexual behavior beautifully. He had great skills, and then he became more aggressive. I'm like, he's just doing something different. It's equally maladaptive. But so there was a lot of variability, and I'd like to say that certain milestones in treatment were the thing that got them out, but not always. But sometimes that was sort of the last thing they needed to demonstrate control over. For a lot of them, they were relatively stable on the wards, other than the fact that they'd had this really serious history of sexual offending. In terms of average length of stay, it changed while I was there, so that made things more complicated. Prior to, I think, about year 3, we were 3 years in, and the average length of stay at that facility for a sex offender was somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 years. Because many of these people were not guilty by reason of insanity, or they were found permanently incompetent for a really violent sexual offense, and the way the state law worked is they could be civilly committed then under guardianship. And so they were there until they were deemed no longer dangerous, which is challenging when you have someone with a really severe offense history. But at about year 3, this was when, you know, the U.S. experienced quite the recession and many facilities were closing, and they said, we're going to have to release some of these people. So suddenly they were going to close a building and release folks, and the average length of stay went from 10 to 12 years to about 6. So it changed. So we don't honestly know at the end how many years a person would have been in treatment before they would have been deemed fit to go somewhere else. And that was unfortunate.
Yeah.
Although selfishly it was really good from a perspective of doing outcome research post-release, because then they released a bunch of people.
Right. Well,
silver lining.
Yeah. Well, and someone asked actually if this has been used in the community setting, and I'm wondering if that's something when someone has been released, if someone hasn't finished, if you have you teamed up with folks in the community to continue this?
Not yet. As I said, you know, if they are, I don't know. And if people are, I'd love for them to contact me. I'd love to see it work in community settings. I've been doing some training with various probation and parole providers in how it could be used in a community setting. I think it would go really well with the idea that, you know, as people re-enter, they're going to be faced with a lot more challenges in terms, you know, in a controlled environment. We can see when they're not regulating well, and we, you know, can more easily in some cases offer them something that they can use as a self-regulatory strategy because they're standing there. Whereas in the community, it relies more on them being able to self-generate. And I think that, you know, that'd be great to see. But no, at this point, I'm not aware of people using it in the community.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I have to, just given the amount of time we have here, I have to move along. We've had some great questions, and I think just if we could also just let people know that we will post, if it's okay to use your contact information, so people do have some follow-up questions. Also, I recommend that people read your book because that's also a great way of getting some more information. Just to let people know that the next New Press webinar is we call them consultanars, or so Ask an Expert with David Prescott. We probably will have one other expert that we're going to invite along, and that's on June 14th. We also have a number of Phil Rich webinars. We have a 3-part series that is going to be starting in May, and you can still sign up for that. It's actually a cost of $60. So there will be a cost, but basically focusing specifically on risk assessment. There's also Phil Rich is doing 2 in-person trainings in Albany, New York on contemporary practices for treatment in June, and also one in October on assessment of juvenile risk. For those who may not be aware that we do have a newsletter, which we take a research article each month and translate that into something which is short enough to read over a cup of coffee, sort of our logo and our slogan. So we hope that you will enjoy those. We actually will automatically sign you up for this, but you can also unsubscribe if you're not interested in learning about this research. It tends to be focusing more on adolescents and adults. Last, as I mentioned earlier, we could not do this without the help of our sponsors. That our sponsors include the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the Crime Prevention Branch, Family Life Counseling and Psychiatric Services, Jurina Associates, Gippsland Center Against Sexual Assault, Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling, the Leo Hoffman Center, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, the Morrison Child and Family Services, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, New Hope Centers, the Ramsey County Correctional St. Mary's Home for Children, as well as the Yarrow Counseling Services. If you want to become a sponsor, we're actually accepting sponsorships for next year. It's $98 for an individual. You get a guaranteed seat at the table. It's $250 for an organization, where you can have up to 10 people registered for your organization. You get access to CE credits. You get 2 free New Press books. So if you're interested in this, you can email us at info@nerypress.com or contact Diane Mansfield directly at this phone number. Last, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to you, Dr. Stinson and Jill. This has been just really a wonderful, wonderful webinar. You had no reason to be nervous. You did a fabulous job. And, and thank you to everybody in the audience as well. Again, it's the audience that makes this happen. Even though we can't see you, can't hear you, we can see your questions. And it's wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic. Thank you again so much, Jill.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and for everyone for attending.
Absolutely. All right. Take care. And remember, everybody, please